welcome to the after lunch hour. And we have specially honed and groomed members of the panel here to get us through this experience. I apologize to you for the other two panels taking you into the kitchen and showing you how sausage is really made, regardless of what the academics say. Is that better? Okay. I'm only going to take a few minutes here because I want to save as much time as possible for Q&A. And who's my Q&A finder helper? Well, when we start that, I'll admonish that person to try to get as many students included as possible. Enough graybeard questions. What do the youngsters think of them? What's going on in the world and what we've told them? I'll start with Secretary Geren and move on to Nora, and then Professor Ippolito. You get the bat cleanup. And without further ado, sir.
Thank you, Monty, and those of you who had the determination to stay around after that great lunch and not go out and take a nap, I appreciate your being here. It's a privilege to be here with some of the folks that I had the opportunity to work with and work for, and people that I just admire as much as anybody I've ever known in my life. And thank Pete and Carter and Buzz and Gordon for your extraordinary service. It really was a privilege to have the opportunity to work with all of you. The subject, money and politics, and I've been struggling to figure out exactly how I'm going to connect money and politics to, well, it doesn't say it there, but budget and strategy. Bible says that money is the root of all evil, and I don't want to argue with the Bible, but I think that as far as explaining some of the problems we have in public policy today, I think that the role of money is exaggerated. I don't think that it drives fundamental policy like a lot of people think it does. I think it's grossly overstated. I don't think all the money in the world is going to turn Ted Cruz into a liberal, or all the money in the world would turn Nancy Pelosi into a conservative. I think most of the people in the Congress, most of the people in government are really voting their hearts, voting the interests of their constituents. It's not to say that on the margins it doesn't move some votes, but I think the fundamental issues that we really face as a country, the ones that are dividing us, the ones that are at bottom, the ones that we're most struggling with today, I think those are really ideological divides in this country. I don't think that they are driven by political contributions. I will say, though, I think that money is a problem because so many of the politicians have to spend so much time raising money today, much more so than when I was in the Congress a short time ago. A garden variety congressional race will take $2 million today, and a guy or gal has to raise that every 2 years, so they spend way too much money raising money. But I think that people that give money to people who vote like they want them to vote, but the person who takes the money is voting like he or she believes he should vote. And the money follows those beliefs rather than the beliefs follow the money. I do think, however, that there are areas where there are some irrational influences on the defense budget that are significant, and it was at least alluded to in the earlier discussion. Constituent interests are an irrational influence in the making of defense policy. Whether it's you can't close a base. I remember when I was in Congress, and Gordon England and I were working together a little then on the F-16, and I had the opportunity to go meet with Sam Nunn over F-16s. And Arnold Panaro worked for Sam Nunn at the time. And Senator Nunn talked a little bit, and those of you know Arnold talked a lot. And Arnold said, we're going to have to stop making those F-16s before there's an F-16 in every garage in America. And he said, because we expect to have a C-130 in every garage in America. And there's still today, I assume in this defense budget this year, there's probably, I don't know how many C-130s that the Air Force does not want. They're still making them. So you have these constituent interests that are not money-driven, that are, to the extent it's important to the local economy, it has an economic impact, but it becomes part of the heart and soul and fiber of a community. We lost our Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Carswell Air Force Base. Growing up in Fort Worth, you just came to believe that was part of the heart and soul of this, of our community and part of the heart and soul of our nation's defense. Your constituents believe that, you believe it, and you fight like crazy. Now, you expect the Base Closing Commission to do its job and close it, but you do have some dumb decisions made by the Congress, not driven by money, but driven by constituent interests and driven by the connection that the members of Congress have to their communities. I don't know what percent. Robert Rangel and I have discussed, tried to put a dollar figure on how much of the defense budget goes to things that we absolutely really don't need. Some of those constituent initiatives end up being very important initiatives. Most of them are not. Most of them are dumb. Most of them are a waste. And as far as budget and strategy, to me, that's a bigger issue than as political donations and money in politics are so often thought to drive strategy. I'll just say quickly in close, to me, the AARP, which I'm proud that I have not joined, it drives more votes than any constituency in America. I can assure you the defense industrial complex pales in comparison to the power of the AARP. And I think it's the press and cynics like to blame everything on the evil of money, drawn on probably the only verse in the Bible they know. But there are more passionate causes that really move the big decisions in the Congress. Resistance to base closings, C-130 in every garage, jobs in a community, AARP scaring the death out of old folks. That's what makes us do irrational things much more than political contributions. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, and I also want to thank the organizers of the conference for having me here today. I thought I would start with talking a little bit about what strategy means, not at the grand strategic level as we heard about at lunch, but what people think about when they start thinking about what a strategy really entails. And I'm sure, if you take Josh's classes or you sit in any classroom, even in the war colleges, you get a very traditional definition of strategy being the relationship between ends, ways, and means. The ends being the objectives that you want to achieve, the ways being the financial resources that are behind it, and the ways being how you link the two. And that's sort of the canonical view of how strategy should be. I kind of feel like what General Corelli said this morning, that he wanted to go back to his former students and tell them that he lied. I don't want to tell you to not listen to Josh and his colleagues. But the reality is that's not how strategy is made in Washington. Even though logically everybody, any defense analyst you talk to, anybody who's served, that's the way it should be. You should start by identifying your ends, and you should start by saying what your objectives should be, and then work backwards and figure out the resources that you need to allocate to achieve that. Right? That's the way everybody wants it to work in an ideal world. That's how it should work. But that's not how it works in Washington. And particularly today, we see the strategy being much more budget-driven than being driven by a discussion about what the right ends are. I want to talk a little bit about what the budget realities are, just to put a really fine point on it, because a lot of these numbers have been thrown around, but I want to build to a particular point about what these numbers mean. So we talked about the term sequestration that basically includes $1 trillion of cuts to the Defense Department over a 10-year period that starts in 2011, so it would go until 2021. And as was noted this morning, $487 billion was already agreed to be cut out of the defense budget. So the part that we're debating and discussing now is about an additional $500 billion over 10 years on top of that. The way that the cuts are structured by law, the Budget Control Act of 2011, fiscal year 14, which started on October 1st of 2013, is actually the worst year for a variety of very technical reasons. More money will be cut out of the fiscal 2014 budget than any other single year in that 10-year period. And already by about 6 months ago, when I ran the numbers on this, the base budget had declined from its peak by about 21%. From the peak about in 2010, and once you take the war spending, the OCO funds that were mentioned this morning, once you take those down to defense spending will be down by a total of about 33% by 2021. Okay, so those are pretty large numbers. They're not that high by historical comparison. If you go back and you look at the drawdowns after Korea, Vietnam, and after the end of the Cold War, it is about by a third. So the percentage is historically consistent. And in fact, we're even a little bit better off than we had been after those, because we have increased defense spending by 40% since the September 11th attack. So we're still spending slightly more, even with all of these cuts, than we did before. So why is this such a problem? Well, it is a huge problem, as you heard this morning, but being able to explain why is very complicated, because it seems like we should be doing pretty well, better than historical average, and that there's still a lot of money in the Defense Department. The reality is what is making these cuts so disastrous, for the reasons that you heard about this morning, is internal cost growth within the department itself. The fact that the defense dollar today does not buy even close to what it bought in 2001, much less going back to some of those historical comparisons. And the generals who spoke this morning rightly emphasized non-discretionary funding, but I want to really dive into that a little bit so that you understand what the trade-offs are that are being chosen. The biggest increasing expenses within the Defense Department exactly parallel the debate that we're having in the rest of society. It's about military health care, which is the equivalent of the Medicare debate for normal citizens, and it's about retirement, which is effectively the equivalent of the Social Security debate. So when you talk about mandatory versus discretional spending in the regular budget, you have the exact same problem in the military budget. In fact, it's worse in some ways because the costs of those programs are increasing even relative to the cost growth in the healthcare and Medicare systems because of a variety of perverse incentives that I can go into at great length if you're interested in this level of detail. Military healthcare rates are rising very much higher than civilian rates, which are already rising very considerably. And as was mentioned this morning, about a third of the budget goes to pay and benefits for military personnel. If you include civilians, that goes up to about 45%. We'll round off and we'll call that half of the defense budget. If left unchecked, and this has nothing to do with sequestration, okay? If I could wave my magic wand and make sequestration go away, this point would still be true. By 2039, the entire defense budget, every single dollar in the defense budget would be taken up by personnel costs. Not a dollar left for anything else, not a single soldier, nothing. Okay, so we have a huge problem because of sequestration, but we have a much deeper underlying problem in the financial sustainability of the Department of Defense. My colleagues at CNAS and I wrote a report that we released last June called The 7 Deadly Sins of Defense Spending. We actually put a cover on it that has a dollar bill going up in flames because we wanted to get lots of attention to it. But what we went through in our analysis, we looked at various DoD business practices and some of the personnel benefits that exist, and concluded that if you reform some DoD business practices, make modest change to personnel pay and benefits without breaking faith with those who have served, critically important point, and you actually fund some of the base closures that people have talked about, you could save enough money to compensate for most, if not all, of the sequestration cuts. Okay, I take General Corelli's warning this morning that you have to be wary about the estimates of efficiencies and that they never pan out. But we'd made some very, very moderate assumptions in the way that we did our analysis in that report, and concluded you could buy back a fair amount of those. And those dollars are things that are going to the pointy end of the spear, to combat capabilities, to personnel. You would not have to make any of those cuts. You could leave everything you had intact if you were willing to make those trade-offs in pay, benefits, and particularly base closures and other DoD management reforms. Of course, all of those things that I mentioned are subject to congressional approval, right? And that's why they emphasize they don't have the ability to go in and touch that part of the budget. And there's virtually no chance that Congress is going to do most of these things. So that leaves the sequestration cuts being really, really bad, right? Because I said you have to add on another $50 billion a year of cuts over 10 years to get that to that $500 billion total, which is about 10% of the base budget. But that's if you take it on 100% of the budget, right? You can't take it on 100% of the budget. You got to take it on 50% of the budget, and then you have an additional 20% cut to every account today, and that's when you have no choice but to start cutting in deeply into the combat capability, as was mentioned earlier. So I walk through all this math to make a very, very strong point here. This is a political choice we are making. Whether we think of it that way or not, this is a political choice about how we are allocating our resources, and we are making, through Congress and what Congress is authorizing and not authorizing, making a choice to cut the combat capabilities of the military to the levels that we talked about this morning, and that I think every panelist who's been up here this morning has talked about as a grave concern. So if you don't like the consequences that we've been talking about, and I would venture to say that defense analysts on both sides of the aisle agree on these numbers. This is not a controversial analysis that I'm talking about here, regardless of political persuasion. You should be organizing to get Congress to do something about it. I wish you the best of luck in doing that, but ultimately, that's where the change is going to have to be if we want to avoid the kinds of consequences of the cuts that we've been talking about today. So let me sort of use that as a baseline and then get back to strategy. So what are the short-term effects of these cuts going to be? A lot of this has been mentioned before, so I'll go through this very quickly. Big hits to readiness accounts and to procurement accounts, because those are the only places where you can save money quickly. You can't get money even quickly from cutting personnel. That's even medium to longer term. So we've already seen a drastic reduction in the dollars that are available for training and pretty severe consequences for readiness. We're going to be accepting much greater risk if we conduct any combat operations anytime soon. And we're going to see cuts to really big programs. And in particular, I also thought of editing this out of my talk when General Mosley was here, but Peter was brave enough, so I'll be equally brave. The program you're going to see cut the most, in my mind, the single biggest program you're going to see cut is the F-35. For the very good reason, the old saying that you rob a bank because that's where the money is. In procurement, the F-35 is where the money is, much more so than any other program. Over the longer term, though, there are some very fundamental strategic questions that the QDR is going to have to settle. I actually am not optimistic they'll do it in the QDR, but that because the timeline for planning for that has ended up being so ridiculously short, but that will really be the strategic way ahead. The first question is whether DoD is going to need to revise the strategic guidance that it issued in January 2012. It pretty clearly stated that if they had to go to the additional $500 billion of cuts I'm talking about, that they would have to revisit the strategy. I actually don't think that we will. Even though we've said we would have to, I think we're not going to see any profound changes in the strategy for the simple reason that we are not going to come out and say publicly that we will not necessarily be able to do things in more than one region of the world at a time. Even if that is the consequence, we will not put that in our strategic guidance because that would severely compromise deterrence and embolden our adversaries. So we're going to continue to have a strategy that says, in effect, that we maintain the capability to be ready to respond to crises around the world and in more than one region at a time. That might be nuanced. There was this idea of win, hold, win, and all of those things. I mean, but make no mistake, that's probably what it's going to end up saying. And so you're going to have this increasing mismatch between what the ends are of that strategy and what the resources are, what the means are in order to get there. The second big thing to watch, and again, this point was made this morning, is that the Strategic Choices and Management Review very nicely does set up this fundamental trade-off we face between the capacity, what they called capacity, which really refers to current size and force structure of the armed forces, versus future capabilities. Obviously, you need to do both, but I would argue that the way to try to answer that question, and it's a very difficult question to answer because you need both, as I said, the key question here, as for all fundamental strategic choices, is where are you going to take risk? Right? There's no such thing as absolute security. No security strategy can keep everybody safe at all times. So any strategy is about how you allocate risk and where you're willing to take it. In my own work, I've argued quite strongly that given that we have to take some risk, and I don't like the risks that are being posed by this budget level, as you might have guessed from the first part of my presentation, but given that you're going to have to take risk, I've argued quite strongly for taking risk today in order to invest for tomorrow. The wars that we will fight 10 to 20 years from now will be fought with technologies, systems, and doctrines that simply don't exist today. And I am not a technological determinist. I believe future wars will have an essential human component, But I think that the pace of technological change and the ability that it will open up in things like unmanned systems and so on are going to be absolutely vital for how we think about warfighting a decade from now and well beyond that. But that's controversial, and a lot of people disagree with that and say that we shouldn't be taking as much risk. We should take more risk in the out years because the world continues to be a threatening place today. But as I said, I think that's what the decision that the Strategic Choices and Management Review set up for the QDR. I'm not sure that the QDR will be able to go so far as to answer it, but I do think that that is the fundamental strategic choice that is going to be made, if not as part of the QDR, in the coming years. And I'll stop there.
I think all of us dream of being the last speaker on the last panel after a long day, and so I really appreciate this a lot. And since I thought this was going to be dicey under the best of circumstances, I thought I'd give you something to look at, which I hope works. Here we go. I quite honestly don't know much about defense or defense budgets or all that you've been listening to during these sessions. What I'm going to talk to you about is budget policy. In other words, the other things that drive the problems that have been described in the rest of the session. What are the dynamics? The spending dynamics, the deficit, the debt dynamics. What's the reality, in other words, of non-defense budget policy with which you got to contend and which you really should understand? And the debate on this is partisan, it's polarized, it's usually uninformed, and in many cases it's deliberately misleading. I'm going to try to avoid all of that. And try to give you first some historical perspective or context about how we got to where we are, and then some basic factual information that you might find helpful in appraising the different paths about where we go over the next 10 years. And by the way, I'm going to stop it at that, because when people start talking about the long-term budget challenge and say 2040, 2050, you got to get real about this. If you don't solve the first one, the second one's kind of irrelevant. So there are things you need to do first before you start worrying about the end of the world. And a lot of the debate on this stuff is hyperbolic, it's often hysterical, and what it should be is sober, because I think what you'll see is that the problems that we have on the budget are eminently manageable. They are not of a magnitude that we can't deal with. Whether politically you can resolve them is a different issue, but the thing is, you got to start with some basic comprehension about how big the problem is. And when I said historical perspective, and you see that thing going back to the 1789, you probably think, how long is this going to take? But we're not going to go through the whole thing. A couple of points as we go through all of these data presentations. Try to pick out what you think is really important here and see if it matches at all what I'm going to say. The first thing is this is publicly held debt. And that's the relevant measure of debt that we need to use, which means not 17 trillion, it means 12. And 5 trillion is a big difference. Second thing is that you'll see over time that these levels are especially sensitive to what? Wars and severe economic downturns. We're currently at around 70 to 75% of GDP, with the projections through the middle 1930s, showing current levels of spending and revenues in terms of policies that are now in place, and the deficits that would be incurred if current policy remains in place. And current policy means the Budget Control Act, it means sequestration, it means appropriations caps. But that's about all it means, quite honestly. Everything else is pretty much the way that it was. And the background here that's relevant for our discussion means you can start looking at World War II. We were at 110% of gross domestic product then. You had small deficits and strong economic growth over the next couple of decades. Cut that by more than half over that period of time. Since the 1960s, what have you had in this country? You've had chronic deficits. You've had 6 balanced budgets since 1960. And the debt levels have remained relatively high over this entire period. For example, at the end of 2007 with George Bush, it was at 40%, which is not very much different than it was for most of the period from the 60s until 2007. And then you had the recent upsurge that took place after the severe recession. So what you're seeing here is a reflection of a debt level that has been somewhat volatile, but largely unchanged for a long period of time, where there's been a recent upsurge connected entirely to the depth of the economic downturn that we had a few years ago. Second question then is, since deficits are chronic, and since obviously you can't reduce debt levels or even put them at sustainable levels unless you do something about these deficits, can you balance budgets that have large deficits? And currently, we have about a 4% of GDP deficit. Yeah, that's the right one. This is a great table. At least I think it's a great table. Because this shows you exactly how we went about balancing the budget during the 1990s. And it breaks it down into all of the relevant categories. What you'll see there is, number one, over a period of 10 years, you had a 6.3% of GDP swing from deficit to surplus, which means that's larger than the problem that you're dealing with right now. You'll also notice that this occurred with essentially two changes, and only two real ones. One, you had tax increases, specifically individual income tax increases that affected a good portion of the tax-paying population. As far as austerity, there's only one austerity dimension to that table. That's defense. So you effectively balanced your budget, solved your fiscal problem with two things: post-Cold War defense cuts and individual income tax increases. Now, what happened to the balance once you achieved it? And what happened to the $5.3 trillion surplus that was being projected in January 2001? Back then, you had Alan Greenspan warning Congress that once we'd retired this entire debt, we'd have problems in managing it effectively in terms of surplus reduction. And he said Congress should give this serious consideration. Well, they didn't have to, because the problem disappeared almost immediately. And why? What you got? Tax cuts, you got war, and you had domestic program increases during the Bush administration. So the Bush deficits from 2002 to 2007 added $1.7 trillion in deficits. But with all of this, and the reason it was considered kind of politically tolerable, the reason that Dick Cheney could say deficits don't matter, is that when Bush took office, debt GDP was at 35%, and in 2007, it was at 40. In other words, nothing terrible had happened. And if he had left it at that point, everything would still be fine. But then, of course, you got the big surge. 2008, a big deficit, and then you got 2009 to 2012. $5 trillion in deficits, an increase in debt to GDP of 30+ percentage points. So now you've got a real problem. And the problem is, how are you going to resolve this? In other words, how are you going to stabilize the debt level? And there's two ways to look at this. You can say we want to bring it down. Well, that's a very, very ambitious goal. But just keeping it where it is going to be a bit of a problem. So let's see about the next one. There we go. I'm not sure this shows up as well as it should. But what you can see with that little, I guess it's yellow, lower extension, is what would have happened if the world hadn't changed after 2007. And you'll see, by the way, that that GDP level is going to decline over time. Now, why would that be, do you think? And the reason for it, the primary reason for it, was that at the end of 2010, the Bush tax cuts were supposed to disappear. You would go back, in other words, to the revenue levels that you had had during the 1990s. Instead, where we are in 2013 are those two blue elements up at the top, 2001 and 2013. And that 2013 reflects largely the impact of the Budget Control Act of 2011, the appropriations caps and the sequesters that you've been hearing about all day. And of course, those projections also take into account the fact that at the beginning of this year, we enacted a $4 trillion tax cut. Most of the Bush tax cuts were extended and extended permanently. And so when Republicans describe what happened earlier this year, they say there was a tax increase. When you measure these things in budget policy terms, there was a tax cut. Current law meant the expiration of all the cuts. The fact is only a small slice, the top 1% perhaps, adjusted gross income over $450,000, a somewhat higher marginal rate, somewhat increased capital gains and dividends rates. So what you have here at a time of supposed budget austerity and deficit and debt problems is a $4 trillion tax cut that starts you on the road to redemption. So one of the things to understand here is there's another part of the budget. You know, that's the taxes that people pay. And by the way, the taxes that political leadership explains to people that they need to pay. You know, we had a discussion this morning about sacrifice. You know, taxes are a sacrifice. Let's see about the next one, because this will give you, again, an idea of the dimension that we're dealing with here. What you'll see here is that for a long period of time, several decades, you had outlays averaging about 21% of gross domestic product, and you had revenues averaging about 18% of gross domestic product, which means that over the whole period, if you translate it into deficits, what you got are 3% of GDP deficits on average. Well, if you look at what happens next under current policy, what do you see? You see that the spending line goes up over the historical average, and it'll be climbing. The revenue level goes up over that historical average, but it's going to be flat. And therefore, the current law deficits that you're dealing with are going to be larger than the historical deficits that allowed you, in effect, to stabilize debt levels for an extended period of time. And the rule that they generally follow here is this. If you can keep your deficits at 3% of GDP or less, then your debt level is not going to increase, or at least not increase appreciably. Once you get above 3%, you got a problem. We're currently at about, well, we're going to look at about 3.5% by the early 2020s, which means you're going to have a slight uptick in those debt levels. So your real conundrum here is how do you take that space between current law spending and current law revenues and narrow that sufficiently so you don't have future increases in debt. And that brings me to the next one, because if you look at this on the spending side, it's kind of helpful to know what you're spending the money for. And as you can see, in 2012, you're spending $3.6 trillion, less than 20% of which is for defense. 35% is in Social Security and Medicare, both of which are going to grow over the next decade, and the levels will continue to increase thereafter. Not only under current policy, but under any politically acceptable resolution for those problems. Then you've got net interest, which is now relatively low. It's only about 6% of total spending, but the reason for that is that interest rates are so low. That will inevitably have to increase, which means that by 2023, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid are going to be eating up roughly half of all of your spending each year. So current law is especially skewed toward certain kinds of programs. And so if you look at this incomprehensible figure that I provided for you here, you can see that austerity is not the same for everybody. That when you look at spending to GDP, some things are going up under current law. In fact, a few things are going up, and most everything else is coming down, and coming down pretty appreciably over that same period of time. So what do you do about this? And if you're looking for the partisan explanations, what I've got here is the so-called House Republican plan and the Senate's Democratic plan. This gives you revenues and then the spending breakdowns. that they would like to see in place if they could by 2023. And as you'll know there's only a modest difference in revenues. What in effect Republicans are proposing is that current law tax policies simply remain in place. And the Democrats are talking about another modest increase, primarily again for high-income taxpayers. So the interesting part here will be the outlay levels. And what do you find? Social Security and Medicare are indistinguishable. Both parties are committed to maintaining those programs over the next 10 years in their current state. Any modifications that might even be contemplated will be modest ones. When you get to defense, this is kind of the distressing part, there's not much difference here between the two plans. In other words, there's not enough to do all of the things that were talked about earlier today under the best of circumstances here if everything else is going to be funded the way that it's supposed to be funded. The net interest numbers, the only reason that that shows a difference is that the Republicans are assuming that by bringing the budget into balance over the next 10 years, you'd reduce the increase in debt, and therefore you'll have interest savings. So you can throw that one up as a kind of fanciful number. But then you get to all other. And all other is really where most of the action is going to be. What you're talking about here are all entitlement programs except for Social Security and Medicare. You're talking about all the entitlements for the poor, and you're talking about all discretionary domestic programs, everything from building roads to scientific research. What you're talking about there in the Republican plan is something that's smaller than we were doing pre-Great Society. And what we're talking about in the Democratic plan is something that effectively consolidates most of what is now in place. So when they talk about cutting spending, it's important to recognize that they're only talking about one part of this puzzle in any serious way. They're talking about non-elderly entitlement programs, or put it another way, entitlements for the poor, and they're also talking about discretionary domestic programs. And the fight over those programs has been going on since the 1960s and has never been resolved ultimately because it can't. So with all of that in mind, and I hope some useful information in these charts, I thought I'd give you one final thing, because this is what nobody talks about, or at least neither party talks about, which is revenues. And one useful way of looking at revenues is to look at the average tax rates for all households by income group over an extended period of time. And what you'll see there, I think, should be, again, helpful in framing all of this. Average tax rates for all of these income quintiles has gone down. And the decline for the lower ones has been steeper than it has been for the upper ones. And there's one really good rule about revenues, one of the few good rules that we have, which is that if you are enamored of fairness, then you tax the rich, however you define it. If you really want revenues, then you got to tax the middle class. And so one of the things you got to recognize in all of this is that there's two sides to this, and it's not all spending. But if it's going to be attacked on the revenue side, then there has to be an acknowledgement that significantly higher revenue levels are going to be needed in place to maintain the things you need to be able to do, defense and non-defense. And that if you're going to do those things, the idea that you can simply get those revenues from the wealthy is simply absurd. It simply cannot work. As a matter of fact, if you have a really great memory and you go back to the 1990s table that I gave you, what you'll see there is those are the revenue levels that you'll need to support the spending that we're likely to have at sustainable deficit levels. But no one, literally no one, has advocated a return to those, in effect, Clinton-era tax levels. Republicans find them an abomination, and Democrats are petrified to defend them. So you have the curious thing during the early 2000s with the Bush administration of Democrats criticizing strenuously the Bush tax cuts in 2001, 2003, 2004, and then the 2004 and 2008 Democratic platforms promising to do what? Extend the cuts for all but the top 2%. So there is, in all of this, an unreality about the revenue side of the budget. But sooner or later, quite honestly, serious people are going to have to grapple with this, and serious leaders are going to have to start talking to the American public about the fact that your tax rates have gone down compared to every place else in the world. The revenue levels that we pay are low, and the problem that we have can be resolved so easily with minimal tax increases that will get us out of the kinds of tortured discussions that we had earlier today. If you want a big, strong defense, then you got to be willing to pay for it. And if you want these other things, you got to be willing to pay for them as well. So my story here is a little bit different than everybody else's. There's an answer here. It may not be politically the most attractive answer, but it's one that people are going to ultimately have to face up to. So thanks very much.
On that sober note, any questions for us? Sure, right ahead.
I had a quick question for you about, I think it's sometimes really easy when there are people, sometimes they may not even hear it, oh, the deficit or stuff. Well, it's easy for people to say, not my baby. But when something like Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare starts hitting people's pocketbook, then they're like, tell me more about this. Now, where's this money going? And I was curious to know what the panel would think about the idea of basically a deficit tax, that this tax is basically it's X dollars, and if you vote for a state or national representative that's going to, depending on what their stance is on budgetary spending, your $50 a month or whatever it is you pay may go up or down depending on who you vote for. Because if it's something, oh, my great-great-great-grandchildren are going to have to pay for this if the United States is still around and breathing at that time. I mean, is that something that, and pretend that it can be implemented, or even if it takes 15 years, is that something that would work for people? Do you think that even if it would come back around and they would start ringing the phones of their representatives saying, hey, what's happening with this? I mean, is that something plausible?
I would say it's plausible, it's reasonable, but I don't think it's politically practical. The future generations tragically don't have a seat at the table in the Congress today. They just flat don't. And what you're talking about is just trying to have some intergenerational fairness in those policies. But that issue is raised in so many different ways right now. And the Congress, the elected officials, choose to say no when those efforts are initiated to try to pay for some of our current consumption and be fair to future generations. Money's fungible. If you had a deficit or a debt tax, that would mean that they're going to spend more money somewhere else. It's unlikely that they're going to lower the caps on other areas of spending. So I think it's a pie-in-the-sky notion. I'm afraid it would be considered just like any other tax. The non-tax people thinks it'll just go into the maw of this monster government that swallows every nickel and then borrows a dime. I think it's theoretically sounds good, but practically speaking, the fact that the future generations don't have a seat at the table, I don't think it's got a chance.
In one sense, a terribly depressing panel. I mean, enlightening and really exciting because like this stuff is really important, but terribly depressing. Nora, you brought up this big problem, which is that what's driving the defense increases are personnel and healthcare costs, right? And I think that's true, but the problem is that no politician wants to take the risk of saying, I'm the guy that's cutting military pay and benefits, right? It's a political non-starter, and Dennis's comments were quite similar on the tax issue. Right? We can very clearly see that if you want to raise revenue, you've got to do more taxes across the board. But both parties have basically agreed that except for the top tier, we're not going to fight that fight. We both agree that no taxes are the way to go. So I'm trying to figure out a way out of this. Okay? I'm trying to figure out if the answer has to be that Congress chooses one of these big constituencies to punish, either active duty military who gets their pay and benefits hit, or the broad tax base who gets to pay more every year. Is it possible that there's a third possible solution here that's something that nobody entails but is inevitable? Because these two things seem politically intractable. That in the long run, the thing that happens, whether we like it or not, is retrenchment. The thing that Peter Feaver was worried about in his lunch talk, right? The idea that we will just simply not do as much in the world, accept fewer defense burdens, accept fewer foreign obligations, simply because we can't afford them and we're not ready to burn one of these two big constituencies. Is that inevitable?
I don't think that is inevitable, because I think that there are some relative being the key word here, but some relatively modest things you can do that don't actually directly affect many active duty military members that can help right some of the dynamics that I was talking about. Even if we couldn't go to anywhere in terms of revenue, even if you have to live within the sequestration cuts, and obviously that's not your only option, and I think that your presentation was excellent in terms of putting it in the broader fiscal context. Most of what is driving the disproportionate increase in the military healthcare and retirement benefits have to do with benefits that were expanded after 2001, and benefits in particular for retirees, in ways that can and should be adjusted, that are still fair and don't break faith with what was promised. So my favorite hobby horse example are TRICARE premiums. Right? For retirees, these are not active duty people, totally different military medical account. I'm probably going to annoy all of the retired generals and admirals sitting in the audience. Well, I'd like to be honest, I'd like to see it be louder, and particularly not from the folks who are sitting here, but I would love the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to stand up and say, not as clearly as I think it needs to be said.
I'll tell you, in fact, the chairman did, and we took it to Congress 4 times with a uniform leadership uniformly supporting it, and lobbied on the Hill, and we got thrown out, spit out like a castor oil.
My question is whether Congress would do this, because Congress says we're hating the troops if we do something like this, even if the Joint Chiefs, even if the Secretary of Defense says this needs to be addressed. I just don't know if there's any congressional to do.
Yeah, I tell you, you got Deputy Secretary of the Defense who broke his pick on that year after year.
Not only did they throw it out, but they put in law that we could not, propose that going forward in budget. We said, hell, we're going to propose it. We all got, sandbags. They actually wrote in language. This was something we were not ever going to pursue against. Well, and then the fact of the matter is, all these people vote, right? More veterans vote than active military votes. The fact of the matter, right? There's more retirees than are active, so more money keeps filtering towards that end of the spectrum. It's a political process.
Nora, I think there's some mythology there also. I'll speak for myself, but I suspect we all see it the same. I don't see a problem with increasing premiums on retirement. I don't see a problem with generic pharmaceutical drugs. I don't see a problem with co-pays. I don't see a problem with any of that. But the retired guys that vote, a lot of the retired community that votes sees that as a direct threat because we've not articulated the detail. And there is a notion of you're taking something from me as opposed to explaining what are the accounting realities of the care that you've been promised. You don't want to walk the dog back from the promise, but you still want to be able to square the budget at the end of the day. So whether you come off with contract premiums, whether you come off with et cetera, I don't think any of us have a problem. We all testify that that's where you got to go to get the money. But the mythology out there from the AARP-like folks distort that a little bit. And the Secretary of England is the poster child for breaking his pick up this, because all of us sitting with him is, you evil people are trying to crater the entire military retired healthcare system. When in fact, we're just trying to make it sustainable.
Here's one talking point I would like to see more in that debate that I think would resonate more with the American people. 5 out of 6 people who serve in the military never get any retirement benefits, and that includes the health care. So I think you say that to most Americans who don't understand the military, who don't know that you have to be in for 20 years to get any retirement benefits at all and to be eligible for these programs. You know, I think a lot of Americans look at this and say, you know, these are the people who have served our country, we can't touch anything. I think there's an educational component to this too, and I think beyond the accounting exercise, I think there is the potential to make a fairness argument here too, to make very clear that all of the benefits I'm talking about go to 18% of those who have ever served in uniform.
I don't want to sound like we've been there, done that, and we have to do that. You know, it absolutely has to happen, and I think the copay is more important than the premiums because it shapes behavior. But it was, we tried it year after year after year in the Bush administration, and then I went over nearly a year into the Obama administration, and Secretary Gates tried to get the Obama administration to advocate it. They looked at it, OMB looked at it, and decided it was just a political hill too steep to climb, as popular as the president was in his first year. So, I mean, you're exactly right substantively, and I think it's one of the most frustrating defeats politically that the department has had, because it makes so much sense. I mean, it's on the facts, on the merits, it makes so much sense, but it is a death in politics, and I'm not sure I can explain why, but it is.
Well, let me just say one last thing, and then I will let this go. We are in a very fundamentally different financial situation facing the Department of Defense than before, and I think it is, I would never say that this is easy, and it may still be a fool's errand. But given the magnitude of the cuts that are coming, I think, when we're talking about the kind of capabilities trade-offs that we're making, this should be the single point that everybody who cares about the military should be making in unison for a very long time, even if it is ultimately unsuccessful.
I agree.
I can just comment really quickly and then ask a question. I'm in no way an apologist for the VFW or MOAA or any of these groups that are resisting this, but I would say that in their shoes, I think they would see this move as the camel's proverbial nose under the tent. Yeah. And so, from my perspective, I can understand why such a thing makes them uncomfortable, because they would say, well, yeah, sure, that makes a great deal of sense, and then what? Then what happens next? The minute you guys raise our rates, then what? And it's always going to come out of the hide of the service members. And so from a certain perspective, you can see their argument. You can see their concern that this is just step one of a long process of steadily depriving retired service members of their benefits. So I think it has to be part of a package of other reforms. And so, this gets back to, sorry, this is my hobby horse, because I've been sitting around the Pentagon looking at all these civilians and going around the world to all these headquarters going, what are these people doing here, and why are we paying them all? And so I think the pain, politically, the pain cannot come only from the retired service members. You can't make that your front piece of any kind of effort like this, right? It has to be part of other things. So anyway, I don't know if you all have comments about that, but it seems to me that however meritorious these proposals, it looks bad, because it looks like you're making the service members suffer first before letting the other people take some of the pain.
I just jump in and say that I completely agree with that, and I emphasize that because the math is easy to see, and it is this long-term trend that is in the long term more harmful than sequestration. But I think that's absolutely right, and that's when I said business practices in the way we categorize it, civilians came under there. But it's so big and so important. You're right to call attention to it as part of the package of what
But
needs
it's
to be done.
probably going to take some sort of a crisis to get the momentum going on the Hill, the concern going on the Hill, that they would allow someone to come in with a program like that. It just won't happen out of due course. I mean, I'll make an impact on some of my colleagues here. Why should we accept for flag officers and sergeants major the California principle that you can retire and make more in retirement than you made on active duty? Doesn't make any sense. I mean, I know why Congress passed that, and it was great. We had a war going on, but why are we doing that now? And there are other things like that you could also add to this comprehensive
And I think that's one of the reasons it's so good to have new administrations and new presidents, because you do have to take these things on, and somebody has to charge that hill again, and it's you just get tired and frustrated and discouraged.
Yeah, but every once in a while there's a chance you might make it to the top.
Yeah, you might. That is no. I'm serious. I just you see the new folks come in and with some of the same ideas, but good ideas, and that new energy, that new enthusiasm, and there may be that seam that they can. Yeah. It's your point. You just got to keep pushing. At some point, it's going to work. When the stars align. But it is harder than I ever would have imagined. It's so rational. It's substantively just compelling, but politically, it has been worse than a non-starter. I was. So, but keep in mind.
The tone has gotten so downbeat and depressing. I would like to challenge the panel and members of the earlier panelists today to come up with some positive ideas, things that might work, thinking out of the box here, possibly impossible things, but things, plus, that could possibly work and maybe lift this miasma away from the audience.
Yeah.
Well, quite honestly,
we're
I
all
don't
those
think,
policy people that are supposed to do that. What happened to them? Leave it to us executors.
I don't think this is downbeat in terms of what I'm talking about, quite honestly. You just have to have a little sense of realism here. And the thing is that you're talking about funding defense at levels that would be acceptable, doing virtually everything that we're doing right now otherwise. And you're talking about doing that at about 25% of gross domestic product under the worst conditions, quite honestly, all right? And the thing is that people got to recognize when they're talking about this, that doesn't make you France. It doesn't even come close to being France. And, there are times when government grows in size. And it's a reflection of different circumstances and different public understandings of what they want from their government. But think about it this way. I'll try to make this real brief. 1930, government's 3% of gross domestic product. 20 years later, it's over 15%. In other words, the relative size quintupled over 2 decades, and the world didn't come to an end. We've been at 15 to 21 ever since then. And one of the things, by the way, that kept deficit problems under control as the welfare state expanded and as the welfare shift kicked in was that you drew down defense. Defense was the way that you funded most of the welfare expansion since 1950. Now what you've got is a point where defense can't do that anymore. You're not drawing down from 10% of GDP, which is where we were back then, to where we are now. We're at 3 now, and we're dropping. Well, you can't fund much of a welfare expansion anymore. So what that means is you've got a different fiscal reality. You've got a demographic situation. You got to recognize it. I mean, that's just a fact. So you add the demographics to a defense base that you need, and I think some of you ought to articulate the case for going above 2.4 or 2.7, both of which I think are needlessly restrictive, and by the way, translate into these strategic retrenchment theories that I don't think are necessarily fiscally driven or fiscally necessary. And so, you have this curious phenomenon, particularly of people who support larger defense budgets. I'm talking about the military, but people out in the public who, on the other hand, think spending is going all to hell, and we're becoming socialist. And I had a friend of mine from England. He went to the embassy party after the last election, and this woman grabbed him and said, America's going to socialism. And he told her, what are you talking about? Right? I can tell you what socialism is, and you people don't have a glimpse or a clue of what that actually means. So the rhetoric here is just inflated, and it's not very helpful at a time when things are serious. But it's not downbeat. In other words, when I say these problems are eminently manageable, if you're over in Europe and you're looking at our budget situation, you would pray to God that you could change places.
You
Here
don't
he
look
comes.
much
This
happier.
is the man with the solution.
One change, Peter Fevers, he was finishing up, and I think from the politics of the Congress, that offers a different scenario than perhaps we've seen before, and I don't know if it's good for defense or bad for defense. I'm worried that it's bad for defense, but from Vietnam till the present, you had largely an isolationist Democratic Party, or at least one that didn't support the traditional view of American intervention abroad. Right now, at least if you look at the House of Representatives, the isolationist wing of the Republican Party is becoming increasingly ascendant. And I'm not sure how long that's going to last, but it appears to me that it's a wave that is still gaining steam and not starting to recede yet. A concern I have, and I don't know really how to think it through, if we have an ascendant isolationist party and we still have the San Francisco Democrats running the Democratic Party when it comes to defense, we face a very different Congress than we've ever faced before. We pro-defense folks had always in the past been able to go to Republican caucus, conservative Democrats. It was a coalition that even when Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, we were always able to get a majority for a traditional view of, or at least since I've forgotten what your term was, but the regenerative legacy defense policy, what is it, Peter? And now I'm not sure you can put that together anymore. It was, there's no more Southern Democrats, and you've got the isolationist Republicans, at least within the caucus, to the extent that reflects the Republican Party, on the ascendancy. And I think we're in a congressional world that we've never seen before, at least not in my recollection, not since I've been paying attention to it. And I don't know what that means. I think we might deal with some of these entitlement issues, the military entitlement issues, because you don't have people that are that passionate, frankly, about the defense budget. So that might present an opportunity to do some of those things that we haven't been able to do in the past. But we have a very different Congress than we had as recently as 10 years ago.
Can I just speak directly to that? Because I think to borrow, I think Buzz who said this, it's worse than that. It's worse than you say. That, by the way, that's what they said they would put on my tombstone. That was my contribution to every conversation was it's worse than what you said.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party learned from Vietnam the mistake of being perceived to be anti-military. And so since 9/11, Democratic Party has been very careful not to be seen as anti-military. They could oppose military policies. They could certainly and actively oppose the wars that the military are fighting, but they wanted to do it in a way that would not be perceived as anti-military, because they thought that was the mistake they had made post-Vietnam. The solution that they hit upon was to compete and outcompete with Republicans on pay and benefits. They weren't opposed to the military because they were willing to give even more in pay and benefits, even though they opposed, say, the war or whatever. And then, of course, Republicans didn't want to get on the outflanked on that, and so you had this escalating competing. And I think that partisan dynamic is still there. So on the Democratic left, it's okay to cut the F-35 or to go down to 7 aircraft carriers or whatever. That cuts to combat power are okay, because you won't be tarred as anti-military, provided that you protect the pay and benefits piece of it. So the political dynamic, I think, makes it worse. But you're absolutely right that on the Republican side, what is missing, what was really changed is, on the Republican side, they're saying, yeah, we could go down to 7 aircraft we could do without this, that weapon system. And that used not to be there on the Republican side. It's there now.
So you still have a overwhelming majority constituency for the benefits side, the non-discretionary side, but not for the warfighting
Right.
side. That is
In the back.
more bad news.
Well, sir, thank you for letting the peanut gallery ask the question. And I want to talk about the 21+ million veterans. And I think you have to think about the 3 buckets of health care that you have. It's not just TRICARE. It is Medicare, and it is the VA. And I think when you look at those as an aggregate, then the question becomes, how do you consolidate that? You know, as I had mentioned to General Mosley, and I think he was alluding earlier in his comments, you know, we talk about the grand strategy, but where's the grand vision? And ultimately, the grand vision, at least in healthcare, at least the way I look at it for the veterans, is that the cost of going to war isn't buying all the toys. The cost of war is the 80 to 90 years of healthcare that's going to be expended. And so ultimately, if you talk about TRICARE, one of the biggest problems we have with our veterans in the transition is that we don't explain to them when they come in what they ought to be prepared for. We don't explain to them that, okay, if we're going to make this change and you're going to pay a higher premium, what do you need to do in your financial plans to be prepared for that? So, you know, there's this assumption that all they want is just the benefit, but the veterans will adjust. And I think General Mosley's right. It doesn't matter if the premium goes up as long as they know how to deal with it. And ultimately, if that's a you know, part of what they're going to do to serve their country and certainly in their post years, they have to be prepared, because we deal with it all the time, all across the country in the veteran community. Is some veterans are on TRICARE, and if you take your flavor of TRICARE, TRICARE for Life, TRICARE Standard, TRICARE Gold, they all have different plans. And the problem is that most of the veterans don't even know what that means until they have to go to a provider and get health care. And the health care providers, I can tell you today, because we're dealing with several of the health care providers here in Texas, are looking at TRICARE as something that maybe they don't want to take. And that's what we're hearing now.
They're doing.
They're not doing it, sir. And that's the thing. And in fact, I talked to one of the CEOs because an issue came up down at Fort Hood where we had one of our veterans' children almost drowned and needed to come to care at a higher level in pediatric neuro care. And they were told, well, we don't accept TRICARE. So how do you take an active duty young man and tell him that you can't come to a place that could actually do something for their child? So after a lot of machinations, it got taken care of. But the CEO, who's also a veteran, he said, well, you know, they pay lower than Medicare. That's what they were looking for. So I would contend that in Congress, you ought to take a look at all these programs that we do, smooth those out. And this also includes the entitlements, especially the military entitlements, whether it's Title 10, 35, or 50, and try to address just those buckets.
How old was this veteran?
Well, the
This
veteran
active
was
duty
actually in Kuwait. He was 25.
He
His
shouldn't be on
daughter
Mic-
was 2.
He's not on Medicare. He's on regular TRICARE.
No, he's on TRICARE, but what I was saying is describing what the CEO said, that he was using that as an excuse not to take the TRICARE because Medicare paid more. And that's what he was using as a measure of why the service member didn't take TRICARE. So I think a lot of people don't understand that the dynamics going on behind the scene are much more cloudy than you think. So when you make this change over here in Congress and you say, well, we're not going to fund that veteran or the future veteran accounts, you got to look at the fact that not all the veterans are on TRICARE and that they are taken from other buckets as well.
Got a question back here?
Do you think demographics will, in sort of a ghoulish way, help us out at all? In the sense that we do have a generation of veterans now who are dying in huge numbers, and the cohorts we were in Vietnam are much smaller. Is that going to help at all? And also, is that part of it sounds very crass, kind of the PR and marketing problem of changing the benefit structure? Because my father was a World War II vet, my father-in-law was a World War II vet. You are not going to do anything to harm that greatest generation. And then there's a sort of sentimental approach among civilians toward Iraq and Afghanistan veterans that, as someone was saying, we want to make sure we help them. We don't want to go serve, but we want to help them, so we don't want to take anything away from them either. As those cohorts kind of fade back and either go on to their reward or fade back in the civilian population, is that going to help with the budgeting issue at all?
I haven't seen a study that tracks the demography of dying World War II and Korean veterans and the incidence of.
Baby boomers are getting into the Medicare age now. That's what I'm
Well, a lot of, yeah, I mean, what did you say, your father-in-law was, he ought to be on Medicare, he shouldn't be on any, he's got the TRICARE backup.
I'm just saying that whole generation, the oldest generation now that's dying off now are World War II vets. And soon will be baby boomers.
Yeah, and I haven't seen a study on that. That'd be an interesting thing to look at.
One thing, I guess, Pete is guys to look at, but you can go to some areas, there's a military hospital, VA hospital, a civilian hospital, literally within blocks of each other. And they all do the same basic care. And in fact, the military hospital may not do heart and, specialties, and so they go into the civilian hospital. And
You
by the way,
cannot get
none of them
orthopedic
are
treatment
full.
out of Walter Reed if you're a veteran. You're
Pardon?
Not active duty. If you're not active duty, you cannot get certain types of treatment out of Walter Reed, for instance.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, the only time, we tried to do a lot of combinations. We've succeeded one time, and that was in Michigan. That's because Mark Kirk, the congressman, agreed that we would combine, and the Navy agreed to combine a VA hospital with a Navy hospital, and now they have one brand-new magnificent hospital instead of two sort of okay hospitals. She only won, I believe, since 2001, where we ever combined a hospital. And it makes absolutely no sense to have three hospitals in one area given a similar site care. And by the way, you pay for all that.
Yep.
And that's not an isolated case. I mean, there are a lot of circumstances. I agree with Nora. There's a lot of things we could do with the help of the Congress to reduce DOD costs.
Right.
There's a lot of money. By the way, your comment, Pete, about, and Peter, about when the Democrats took over and the war was going on, there was a lot of rhetoric, and, it was really a pretty awful scene in Washington. I went over to the Hill, met with one of the Democratic veterans leaders, and I said I was concerned about the support, right, particularly for OCO, right, the war support costs, because they were always talking about cutting that. And he said to me, Gordon, you never have to worry about it. He said, never again will we be accused of Democrats of not supporting defense. He said, we've learned our lesson. And by the way, it happened. Every time we went over, we got whatever we wanted because it was politically viable to do that, right? And by the way, quote, all the war horses are gone, right? Ted Stevens is gone, Inouye's gone, right?
Bill
Jack
Young.
Murtha's gone, Bill Young's gone, right? Dix is gone. I mean, that whole 5 years ago, right? We had a whole support group in the Congress. Not one of them's left now. Not one of the military guys. Strong chairman is there in the Congress. So I think it's going to be hard going forward, with no base there of people who literally had served and, were highly supportive of the military. I think that's changed.
And people, and Peter referred to at lunch regarding Senator Tower, people that truly were students of the military and of military budgeting, they brought so much more to the conversation than their vote and their power as a chairman. They were respected authorities, and I don't see anybody in the Congress that comes anywhere close to them in either body, really. I mean, I couldn't even name one, really. I don't know. I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm trying to think, is there?
Adam Smith.
Who's that? Adam Smith? Okay.
The ranking member of the House is very, very supportive.
But does he have that profound understanding of the military like the Ike Skeltons or Bill Youngs or?
As much as not more.
Well, that's good to hear. God bless him.
I just want to add one thing to your comment, just to clarify terms a bit. When I was talking mostly about retirement and other benefits that in most cases doesn't get into the whole linked but really analytically separate realm of veterans benefits, which are a whole world unto themselves, and where you start talking about the VA budget. I mean, there's which you could do many whole separate conferences on that. But I focus my remarks on the on the healthcare side and the retirement side, on those retirement benefits rather than veterans benefits, because we're talking about the DoD budget, not the VA budget. So it does have a more limited impact there. But I completely support your broader point that at a national level, all of these things are linked and have to be understood together. But budgetarily, it is a mostly separate problem.
Well, let me just follow up, because if I'm a taxpayer, as many people here are, and 300,000 or million Americans are, the question is, how do you go about, from a budgetary standpoint, knowing that those issues exist, and you can look discreetly at the defense budget and you know, do that as a stovepipe. But at the end of the day, I think at some point you've got to figure out how to do the integration between departments. I mean, and you know, if you think about, and all the military guys know this because, you know, and when the Goldwaters-Nichols Act was put together, that sort of got us coordinated. But there's nothing in the executive branch that really meshes those departments or that budget discussion, and you know, other than what you might do in the congressional debate. But the question is, why not look at it in a more holistic way and not just talk about it in a stovepipe sort of way?
I completely agree with that. I'd even go one step further and say we need to be looking at a broad national security budget, not a DoD budget, not a State Department budget, not an Intel budget. This is not, you know, a brilliant idea of mine. This is something that, you know, is an idea that has been talked about for a long time. The administration actually tried to do that. There are legal reasons why, in terms of, you know, which committees in Congress deal with which issues, you can't present, you know, different committees have to approve things, but they tried to at least present a integrated budget document that was a national security strategy. It didn't get to the VA, but it looked at the Department of State and DoD mostly together. And the unfortunate outcome of that is the State Department got slashed even more than it would have been had it stood on its own, which is absolutely infuriating, right? Because we talked earlier about, you know, the fact that the military is a very important but still only one element of national power, and yet it is the most grossly funded, you know, the disproportionately funded there. So, I mean, I completely agree with you. I would even put it in a, maybe this makes it, you know, that much more difficult to solve, but we really do need to think about our national security commitments holistically.
Well, on that note, folks, thank you very much. Thank you, panel members, for the great discussion. Well done.